You've heard in the last session about Heye's ambition of sponsoring research, and we're going to have a presentation now on one of the areas of research that Heye sponsored, and some of the both opportunities and problems, I think, that arise from that. Our speaker is a distinguished art historian, Ruth Phillips, who's a Canada Research Chair and Professor of Art History at Carleton University in Ottawa. She is published widely in the field of American Indian art and is the co-author of the standard survey text in the field, Native North American Art. Her presentation this afternoon is entitled Salvaging Salvage Anthropology, Revisiting Frank Speck's Field Collecting.
Good afternoon, everyone. I must acknowledge the three talks you've already heard and how beautifully they've built on each other, and I hope created a context for what I will have to add. And we'll say also I have a little bit of repetition as well, but I think that's just built into the fact that we're all focusing on this one wonderful institution and its founder. We owe most of our reliably documented collections of historic Native American art, material culture, language, music, and other aspects of expressive culture to a discredited phase of anthropological practice, salvage anthropology. From the mid-19th century through the first decades of the 20th, virtually all collecting and research on Native American peoples was conducted under its aegis, and justified by the widespread belief that authentic Native American cultures were rapidly vanishing. The link between collecting and the preservation of traces, which would reveal the patterns of human cultural evolution, became so thoroughly naturalized as anthropology in that period that salvage ethnography went unnamed until Jacob Gruber's 1970 article, published just as post-structuralism was ushering in a new era of reflexivity in anthropology. A comprehensive deconstruction and condemnation of this quintessentially modernist paradigm followed and continues to this day. In 2016, a century after George Heye founded the Museum of the American Indian, we have enough historical retrospect to revisit salvage anthropology critically. There can be no doubt about the destructive impact of removing so much Indigenous heritage from living communities, and in combination with the removal of children to boarding and residential schools, endemic racism, and myriad other constraints and deprivations imposed in the name of directed assimilation and modernization, these massive collecting projects ruptured the normal intergenerational transmission of Indigenous knowledges and traditions. Yet, at the same time, the work of preservation was effective and left legacies as rich as its premises were wrong-headed. Far from vanishing, contemporary Native American communities draw on the collections made a century and more ago to support projects of cultural recovery and renewal. The field photographs of ancestors, the wax cylinder recordings of language and music that make their voices audible, and the material products of their artistry and ingenuity that sit on museum shelves are being reactivated to serve as antidotes to the deadening effects of assimilationism. We are then faced with something of a paradox. Can we salvage anthropology itself, conscious of its destructive impacts, but avoiding the nihilistic extremes of deconstruction? As might be expected, when a single term is used to cover almost a century of scholarship and collecting, the umbrella of salvage has been held up over so wide a range of anthropological theories and practices that it obscures important differences among individual collectors and collections. In my talk today, I will urge the need to develop more nuanced and fine-grained understandings of the methods and ethical positions adopted by participants in the salvage project, both non-Indigenous and Indigenous. To make the best use of their legacies, we need to understand collectors as individuals and the ways in which they responded to particular contexts of time and place. We also need to track their evolving practices, and I think Anne already began to do that, and attitudes to grasp the dialogic nature of collecting and how contacts with living communities through collecting could alter modernist tropes of disappearance and authenticity. I begin with 3 vignettes that suggest both the contrasts in past practices and the current critiques. The first is a notorious and often retold event from the annals of the Museum of the American Indian, which illustrates how the premise of salvage could trump the actuality of Native American survivance. In 1934, members of the Hidatsa Waterbuster clan made a request for the return of a sacred bundle needed to relieve the great drought afflicting the western United States. The claimants enlisted supporters to lobby George Heye, such as John Collier, Roosevelt's commissioner for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. 3 years later, Heye and his board finally agreed to return the bundle in exchange for other items of equal value. The press covered the Hidatsa representatives' long journey from North Dakota to New York and their stop in Washington to meet President Roosevelt. J. Alden Mason described the ceremony in the museum in his 1958 biographical sketch of Heye, published by the museum a year after Heye's death. The actual exchange was a spectacular, and I'm quoting Mason, the actual exchange was a spectacular occasion. 2 elderly leaders of the band, Foolish Bear, 84, and Drags Wolf, 75, came to New York in full tribal regalia. At the museum, the proper speeches were made, the peace pipe smoked, and the bundle transferred to the Indian representatives. They presented a buffalo medicine horn in exchange and conferred on George Heye the Indian name of Slim Shin, that of a former faithful custodian of the bundle. An amusing sidelight on the occasion is that Heye handed the Indians the contents of the bundle, skull by skull, much to their consternation, for the contents were cryptic and had never been seen by any living tribesman. It is interesting to note that rain quickly followed the arrival of the bundle at the reservation." Unquote. A quarter century after the passage of NAGPRA, this passage is shocking to read because of its blatant disregard of Indigenous protocols for the handling of medicine objects. The injury was, however, greatly compounded by the fact that Heye did not return all of the contents. And although there is debate about the nature of the deception, there can be no doubt of the culture of condescension and disrespect evidenced by Mason's account. Mason, a curator at the University of Pennsylvania Museum and himself a salvage anthropologist, was confident that his readers would share his amusement and appreciate his heavy irony. Shepard Crack and Edmund Carpenter have interpreted Heye's management of the Waterbuster bundle exchange as evidence of his acquisitiveness and possessiveness. And Carpenter also quotes a letter from Heye to Collier to show how Heye used salvage to justify these impulses. Insofar as the Indians of these times are concerned, it was my intention, which I think I have successfully carried out, to found an institution where the objects which had been sacred to them, but which were falling into disuse and in danger of destruction under modern conditions, could be preserved and given proper and understanding treatment in sympathetic surroundings, unquote. As evidenced by his use of the pluperfect, objects which had been sacred to them, Heye took disappearance as a given, despite the evidence of living belief and practice implicit in the Hidatsa's desire to reclaim their bundle. The second vignette concerns Frank Speck, who began collecting for Heye during the first decade of the last century. Characterized as the self-appointed salvage ethnographer for the tribes of the Northeast, he collected thousands of carefully documented Algonquian and Haudenosaunee specimens of material culture and recorded languages and traditional knowledge among Algonquian and Haudenosaunee communities throughout the Northeast during the first half of the 20th century, including many assumed to have already lost their languages and traditions. Between 1911 and 1916, Speck was collecting both for Heye and the National Museum of Canada, where his close friend Edward Sapir had just established the ethnology division. Speck and Sapir were both trained at Columbia by Franz Boas in a mode of salvage anthropology heavily reliant on comprehensive field collecting designed to trace historical patterns of cultural evolution and differentiation. At the University of Pennsylvania Museum, both were funded by Heye, who had placed some of his collections there, as we saw, and whose support prior to the era of research grants made possible the fieldwork of a founding generation of ethnographers. The almost weekly letters exchanged by Speck and Sapir after Sapir moved to Ottawa yield insight into Speck's fieldwork practices and relationships with his informants. In April 1912, for example, he was working among the Montagnais Innu, living on the north shore of the St. Lawrence River in Quebec. After alerting Sapir that he was about to send the museum a 20-foot-long canoe, a salmon spear, and a toboggan, he wrote, quote, "Now I want to ask you a favor. Will you use your influence with the Department of Indian Affairs, if you have any, to get some help for these North Shore Indians? They are starving off through the neglect of their officials, and chiefly through the prohibition to fish for salmon in the Moisy River. Several American millionaire sportsmen, Mr. Adams of Boston, Senator Aldrich, have leased the salmon rights of this river from the government without consulting the Port Indians, and now not a native can dare catch a salmon without being arrested. So the government is starving the Indians to sell their right to a few American millionaire game hogs. These are very mild Indians, but if they are pressed to starvation, they may cause trouble as they are fairly numerous and the whites few. I hardly think they, the Indians, could even shoot the causers of the trouble, though. At Moisy, they crowded around me asking me to make an appeal for them," unquote. Speck and Sapir kept up their campaign, and in August, Speck wrote from his summer house in Massachusetts to report that he had finally been able to get a fish warden to investigate and promise some relief. And I quote again, "So you see, I got one stave turned, and am not done yet. If they don't do something for these poor devils, I'll threaten to let the whole thing out in the American papers, and that, as I happen to know from friends of the Indians in Quebec, is what some of the political grafters are afraid of. You didn't know I had developed into a sort of political missionary, but if you were to see these poor devils, you would not wonder. This is just a P.S., FGS," unquote. That Speck could not collect a canoe and a salmon spear as material evidence of an historical indigenous subsistence technology without acute consciousness of the unjust laws which were preventing the use of those same technologies and causing great suffering seems a direct product of his fieldwork methods. An early practitioner of participant observation, he boarded with families, shared in their way of life for brief periods, and returned as often as he could. His humanitarian sensitivity and ethics of action presaged contemporary collaborative approaches such as participatory research. That Speck was also conscious of the inevitable distance between his own privileged life and the colonial status of the Innu is evident in his self-ironization as willy-nilly a sort of political missionary, a phrase which contrasts strongly with the condescending irony Mason directed at the Hidatsa other. The third vignette evokes an exhibition created in 2014 by Ursula Johnson, a Mi'kmaq artist who was trained in traditional basketry by her grandmother, renowned artist Margaret Johnson, and in contemporary installation and performance at the Nova Scotia School of Art and Design. She divided her 2013 exhibition, Mi'kwetetum, which translates both as "Do you remember?" and "You do remember," into three sections. The first room contained a series of plexiglass cases whose sides were etched with diagrammatic drawings of traditional baskets made by her great-grandmother, Carolyn Gould, and labeled with the Mi'kmaq terms for their different parts. The cases, however, are empty. In the second room, the archive room, Johnson displayed a group of baskets she had made using only information she found in the ethnographic literature. The resulting objects are aberrant and dysfunctional. Their informational tags convey a history of institutional mistranslation, while the white gloves supplied to visitors disrupt tactile experience and embodied knowledge. In the third room, Johnson performed a laborious and wildly misconceived process for making the black ash splints out of which baskets are woven. Her energetic pounding and gauging produced only mounds of useless shavings. Johnson's project targets the extreme reductionism and sterility which have resulted from the wholesale removals and the discipline-based segregations imposed on Indigenous knowledge by Western academic and museological institutions, a frequent basis for critique of the salvage ethnography paradigm as a whole. Greed and possessiveness, comprehensive collecting and humanitarian sensitivity, a deadeningly analytical approach to material culture. Will the real salvage anthropology please stand up? An obituary written the year after Speck's death in 1950 by his student A. Irving Hallowell, and the article mentioned earlier by Gruber, who was Hallowell's student, provide helpful assessments. Hallowell begins by stressing Speck's efforts to form relationships both in his informants' homes and in his own that went far beyond the scientific objectification of which this paradigm is accused. Quote, Speck not only studied American Indians, but was deeply attached to them, Hallowell wrote. They were as much a part of his personal as his professional life. He also emphasizes the breadth of Speck's research interests, which ranged from the documentation of languages to ethnobiology, technology, decorative art, oral traditions, spiritual beliefs, ceremonialism, social organization, music, and family hunting territories. Speck's lifelong interest in natural history was in particular integral to his ethnographic work, as is evident to anyone using his collections today. His meticulous lists and publications explain the uses of the bundles of bast, twined plant fibers, and animal bones that still sit on museum shelves. On a recent visit to the National Museum of Denmark, for example, Alexandra Nawagabo and I looked at material culture relating to parenting, which is the focus of her doctoral research. Typically, she found in Speck's collections not only baby carriers, but also the moss used to keep the baby dry. We could also have looked at the fungus used as punk to make fire, or a block of wood used to mold the tail end of a snowshoe. Speck was particularly unusual in conducting research in communities, however much or little acculturated they might be, as Hallowell put it. He collected the old and the new, the mundane and the beautiful, and commissioned replicas or models of obsolete items. In this sense, argues Hallowell, Speck's classic ethnography was more akin to ethnohistory than to the theoretical work anthropology had come to privilege. Speck's historical focus resonates with today's emphasis on academic interdisciplinarity. But his holism, I think, is even more strikingly in tune with the work of contemporary Indigenous scholars for whom holism is generated at a fundamental level by the unifying power of Indigenous knowledge and spirituality. Hallowell's closing paragraph, written over 60 years ago, makes this resonance clear. Quote, Speck's attitude toward Native religion was charged with the highest respect and sympathy. He always was extremely successful in eliciting the cooperation of informants and securing reliable information on this thorny topic. He always worked out Native religious ideas with full awareness and knowledge of their ramifications and expression in speech. His vital and recurrent interest in religion brings us very close, in fact, to the inner core of a major part of Speck's entire work. For apart from technology, ethnohistory, and technical linguistics, the songs he recorded, the rituals he described, the myths and tales he collected, the texts he wrote down, all converge toward this common center. The interpretations Speck placed upon certain functions of decorative art likewise show the same lines of convergence. And even if we admit the obvious socioeconomic or ecological aspects of hunting territories, was it not Speck himself who stressed the fact that to the Naskapi, hunting is a, quote, holy occupation, unquote. And that's the end of the Hallowell quotation. Speck's field collecting began as a salvage project, yet I would argue that conducted for over 4 decades in Native American homes and communities, it had a transformative effect on that paradigm, confirming and affirming the validity of a unique worldview, or plural worldviews, which had not died out and which continued to speak across boundaries of nature, culture, and nationality. Gruber also judged holism to be one of salvage ethnography's positive legacies, but he also assessed its negative impacts. Quote, "The very operation of the collection itself," he wrote, "infused the data with a sense of separateness, a notion of item discontinuity that encouraged the use of an acontextual comparative approach," unquote. Ursula Johnson's Miquetetum rightly critiques this sense of separateness and the discontinuity produced by the disciplinary specializations of Western scholarship and the archiving practices of its institutions, which relegate artifacts, photographs, music recordings, and field notes to separate repositories. Bruno Latour identifies these impulses with the modernist project he calls purification, whose fundamental impossibility in view of the actual condition of mixture and hybridity, or if you will, holism, in which we live, leads inevitably to contradictions, confusions, and imbroglios, to use his word. That such mixtures are as present in the Museum of the American Indian as in the National Museum of Canada offers further support for my argument that fieldwork, and specifically the fieldwork of ethnographers like Speck, could exert transformative pressure on the false premises of salvage collecting. Heye's own account of the origin of his collection and the Speck-Sapir correspondence offer evidence of his formation within 2 different collecting cultures. He began to collect, as he recounted, and Anne also told us, when during an engineering project in Arizona, he noticed the Navajo wife of one of the workers biting the seams of a hide shirt to kill fleas. He bought the shirt as well as some, quote, costume pieces and trinkets, unquote, and on his return, as he recalled, quote, "I placed them about my room and I began to read rather intensely on the subject of Indians," unquote. This rather odd beginning conjures up the contemporary domestic displays of white male Indian hobbyists, part settler trophy, part educational curiosity, part nostalgic anti-modernism. Clara Sue Kidwell has speculated that a degree of romanticism may have been at play, and that Heye may have whiled away his childhood summers in Europe by reading the Indian romances of Karl May. As a wealthy upper-class New Yorker, however, Heye also participated in the rare art tradition of collecting, which privileged the unique, the old and authentic, and the aesthetically refined. Art as an end in itself, as Joseph Alsop has defined this tradition. There is abundant evidence of Heye's rare art tradition bias in the Speck-Sapir correspondence during the years leading up to his founding of the Museum of the American Indian, because Speck regularly discussed the decisions that he had to make as to what would go to Ottawa and what to New York. In January 1912, for example, he mentions that he is going to collect among the Connecticut Pequot. Although he was, quote, getting a start in culture, unquote, he predicted that Heye wouldn't want the acculturated items that he expected to find, quote. Heye is particularly mercenary these days, desiring only the oldest, used, and rare specimens, and not a cent for ethnology. And those phrases are in quotes in his letter to Sapir. A month later, Speck passed on the news that Heye had offered to send Paul Radin to South America. Quote, "If Heye is to support the trip, I presume he will want large numbers of specimens and will not be at all interested in ethnological or linguistic results. Personally, I think that Radin would be foolish to accept the offer, even under his present unpleasant circumstances," unquote. That Sapir shared Speck's views is evident in his instructions for Speck's planned trip to work with the Montagnais Innu. Quote, I shall leave the details entirely to you and state merely that we should like to have a representative all-round collection rather than a few pieces of great value," unquote. When Speck wrote back from Newfoundland, where he was reconnoitering, as he put it, work he would want to do among the Naskapi, he again felt it necessary to distinguish his plans from the kind of collecting that he and others had been asked to do for Heye. Quote, "The mentioned articles are not all, quote, old and antique, unquote, like Heye wants, but they are all typical of today," unquote. In April, settled in amongst the Montagnais Innu, he warned Sapir to expect a landslide of specimens, but remarked at the same time, quote, "I did not find it convenient to get anything for Heye, as he is so awfully shy of new articles," unquote. Reading through these letters, one would not expect to find much that is new, acculturated, or mundane in George Heye's collections. Yet in the same letters, we find indications that Speck was buying some similar things for Heye. As time went on, Speck and fellow ethnologists did provide specimens of raw materials and mundane items to the MAI. Many baskets that came from the New England tribes were recently made and functional. The Naskapi collection Speck sold to the MAI in the 1920s included many of the same new commissioned items that are found in other museums. And a wooden trough for making maple sugar from the Six Nations of the Grand River is crudely carved and functional, far from an example of artistic refinement. In the contemporary reactivation of salvage collections, such mundane items are often compelling for contemporary Indigenous people. During a 2012 trip to the National Museum of Natural History, sponsored by the Smithsonian's Recovering Voices Project, for example, Anishinaabe researchers, although intrigued and interested in the beautiful and the old, were most engaged by a collection of very humble birch bark and wooden implements used at the turn of the century by Minnesota Anishinaabe to collect maple syrup. The sight, after many decades, of these simply made birch bark dishes and wooden spouts enabled Toulouse and Alan Corbière to venture into the woods the following spring to record the harvesting process with detailed commentary in Anishinaabemowin. In this context, I would like to give the last words to Abenaki anthropologist Margaret Bruchac, whose University of Pennsylvania Museum blog offers a recent account of the work she and her students are doing with Speck's collections. Bruchac is clear about the radical imbalances of power involved in these transactions. Quote, "Some Native informants chose to actively conceal items and knowledge. In other cases, sensitive items were given away or sold. The most vulnerable informants were the elderly, infirm, lonely, and desperate. They would sell a story for some friendly companionship, some songs for a bottle, a beaded belt for a loaf of bread. Transactions like these suggest a certain degree of trust in Speck as fictive kin, but they also reflect the desperation of the times and the hope that these objects might be kept safe until they could find their way home again," unquote. Yet she also credits the contemporary value salvage collections have today. Discussing Speck's work with the quote-unquote river desert Anishinaabe in Quebec, she points to the challenge that remains today. Quote, "When the traveling and collecting stopped, each of these objects were frozen in time, locked in museum cabinets far from their places of origin. Now these objects offer opportunities to reconnect with the people who created them and the stories embedded in them. This research calls for a return to Maniwaki River Desert, now identified as the Kitikan-Zibi Anishinaabe, people of the Garden River, a place where people still speak about those anthropologists from Philadelphia who came to visit and walked away nearly a century ago." Thank you.